Sean Diddy Combs was once considered untouchable, a man whose influence reached far beyond music. He shaped culture, dictated trends, built empires, and turned his name into an institution. To the public, he was a symbol of ambition realized. To those within his orbit, he was power personified. Yet even the most powerful are not immune to the weight of justice. What began as whispers in quiet corners slowly grew into accusations that refused to disappear. Allegations once dismissed as rumor hardened into investigations, and those investigations transformed into charges. Behind closed doors, evidence was mounting. Testimonies surfaced. Shadows that had followed him for years began to take shape under the unforgiving light of the courtroom. In that room, filled with tension and silence, the world shifted. Jurors leaned forward, families waited with bated breath, and the man who had once commanded global stages now sat powerless, awaiting judgment. Prosecutors painted a picture of manipulation, exploitation, and entitlement unchecked. The defense countered with a portrait of resilience, transformation, and redemption. Every word carried weight. Every glance mattered. Every pause was a reminder that the life of one man and the legacy of an entire industry hung in the balance. This was more than a trial. It was a reckoning, a moment where power and privilege collided with accountability. And when the verdict was read, the walls of the courtroom seemed to echo louder than any stadium crowd he had ever faced. But it wasn't the verdict alone that stunned the world. It was the sentence, a punishment that many believed would determine more than the fate of one individual. It would signal whether influence could shield a man forever, or whether justice could finally cut through status, money, and fame. What secrets were laid bare under oath? Which voices risked everything to be heard? How did years of control unravel in a single moment? And why does this final ruling carry the power to reshape the course of music, celebrity, and justice in America? This is the story of Sean Diddy Combs, the rise, the fall, and the final sentence that changed everything.
Before the courtroom, before the headlines, before the scrutiny, there was simply a young man from Harlem with a vision. Sean Combs grew up in the thick of New York City, raised by a single mother after the violent death of his father. From an early age, he understood both struggle and survival. His childhood was marked by grit, by resilience, by the constant push to rise above an environment that offered little mercy. That hunger for more would become the fuel that carried him into history. In his 20s, Combs stepped into the music business with relentless energy. Interning at Uptown Records, he showed an eye for talent that few could match. Soon he was shaping the careers of artists who would go on to define an era. He had instinct, he had drive, and he had the confidence to create his own empire. That empire became Bad Boy Records, a label that transformed the sound of hip-hop and R&B in the 1990s. With names like the Notorious B.I.G., Faith Evans, and Mace under his wing, Combs turned street culture into mainstream dominance. He didn't just make records, he built a lifestyle, one that fused luxury with street credibility, ambition with excess. His vision stretched beyond music, into fashion with Sean John, into television with MTV's Making the Band, and into business ventures that cemented him as a global mogul. To his fans, he was a model of success, a man who proved that from hardship could rise influence, wealth, and respect. To his peers, he was a kingmaker, capable of launching careers or ending them with a single decision. But with that level of power came shadows that followed him for years. Stories of control, intimidation, and excess that were often brushed aside, buried beneath the glitz of celebrity. The controversies were never far away. Nightclub incidents, violent confrontations, lawsuits, and settlements all became part of a larger narrative that painted him as both untouchable and unaccountable. Some saw him as a businessman protecting his empire, while others saw a man who used fear and influence to silence those who opposed him. Then came the victims. Individuals whose voices began as faint, scattered claims but soon formed a chorus too loud to ignore. Allegations of coercion, abuse, and exploitation surfaced, each account adding new weight to the growing storm around him. The public's view shifted. Supporters began to question what they had once celebrated. Journalists dug deeper. Federal investigators opened files, and slowly, the walls began to close in. This was no longer just about music, no longer about celebrity feuds or industry rivalries. It became a confrontation between a man who once defined an era and a justice system determined to hold him accountable. On one side stood Sean Combs, the mogul, the entrepreneur, the self-made icon. On the other stood prosecutors, victims, and a culture demanding answers. The stage was set, and the trial that followed would reveal whether decades of power could withstand the weight of truth.
By the time whispers turned into formal investigations, Sean Combs was already living under the glare of public fascination. But this was no tabloid rumor. Behind closed doors, federal agents had begun piecing together a web of allegations that stretched across years, even decades. What began as a trickle of accusations soon swelled into a flood. Investigators dug through financial records, contracts, and travel logs. They interviewed former employees, associates, and confidants who once lived within his inner circle. Some spoke reluctantly, fearful of retribution. Others saw it as their chance to finally reveal what they claimed had been hidden for far too long. Each testimony added another layer of suspicion, another reason to question the image of a man once seen as untouchable. Still, nothing was simple. For every voice that accused him, there was another insisting on his innocence. Former collaborators defended him, claiming jealousy and opportunism were at play. Public opinion fractured. Fans who once cheered him now argued endlessly across television panels and social media feeds. Was he a victim of a system eager to make an example of a black mogul, or was he finally being forced to face the consequences of unchecked power? As investigators pushed deeper, contradictions emerged. Witnesses changed their stories. Evidence surfaced only to be dismissed as inconclusive. Leads pointed in directions that seemed promising, but when followed, unraveled into dead ends. It seemed, for a moment, that the weight of accusations might not hold. Perhaps he would walk away once more, untouched, untouchable. But then came the turning point. Prosecutors gained access to a set of private records, documents long shielded from scrutiny. Within those pages, the narrative began to shift. Expenses that could not be explained, transactions that raised troubling questions, communications that painted a darker picture of what went on behind the walls of luxury mansions and exclusive studios. Just when it seemed the case was slipping through their fingers, a new witness emerged, someone from inside his own empire. Their account, detailed and chilling, described a pattern that prosecutors argued could no longer be ignored. Suddenly, the possibility of dismissal gave way to the reality of indictment. The tide had turned. Outside the courtroom, the storm only grew louder. Paparazzi swarmed his every move. Headlines screamed of scandal and downfall. Talk shows speculated endlessly, each commentator certain they had the truth. For supporters, he remained a target of envy and persecution. For critics, the mask had finally been ripped away. And through it all, Sean Combs maintained his silence, appearing calm, composed, even defiant, as though daring the world to bring him down. Yet behind the polished exterior, the walls were closing in. The evidence was mounting. The trial was inevitable. The stage was no longer just set. It was surrounded by tension so thick it threatened to consume everyone involved. And as the investigation came to its conclusion, one question lingered over everything. When the doors of the courtroom opened, would the truth finally be revealed, or would power prevail once more? Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. Every eye locked on the man who had once shaped the sound of a generation. Some came out of loyalty, others out of anger, and many just to witness history. The trial unfolded like a storm. Witness after witness stepped forward, each one carrying a piece of the puzzle. Former associates spoke of nights that spiraled out of control, of decisions made behind closed doors, of the kind of power most people could never imagine. Some accounts were calm, almost businesslike. Others cracked under the weight of memory, their voices shaking as they recalled what they claimed to have seen. The defense fought back hard. They argued that Diddy was no criminal mastermind, but a man being targeted because of who he was, because of his influence, his fame, his money. They painted him as the victim of a system that wanted a headline more than it wanted the truth. But the prosecution countered with precision. They said this wasn't about fame. This was about accountability. They presented records, testimonies, timelines that seemed to chip away at the image of the untouchable mogul. The room felt divided. Some believed he was being unfairly dragged down. Others believed the evidence was undeniable. And in between, there were unanswered questions, rumors of deals made in the shadows, whispers about who else might be involved and whether the full story was even being told. Every new revelation left people wondering, would this man walk out free, or was this the moment the empire he built finally collapsed? The air inside the courtroom was heavy, almost unbearable. Hours of testimony, weeks of arguments, years of speculation, all of it had led to this single moment. Every eye was fixed on the judge. Reporters leaned forward with pens hovering. Family members sat frozen in silence. Even those who had followed the case from afar could feel the tension pressing down. Diddy sat at the defense table, his face unreadable. For decades he had been larger than life, commanding stages, charting careers, shaping culture. Now he was just another man, waiting to hear the words that would define the rest of his life. The judge spoke slowly, deliberately, each word landing like a stone. He recounted the accusations, the evidence, the arguments on both sides. It wasn't just a summary. It was a reminder of everything the world had witnessed, of the empire that had been pulled apart piece by piece inside this courtroom. And then came the sentence. A few words, but they hit with the force of a hammer. The room erupted. Gasps, muffled cries, murmurs of disbelief. Some clutched their heads in shock. Others wept openly, unable to contain years of frustration and pain that had built up around this case. Diddy didn't move at first. He sat still, almost frozen, as if to be told this was all a mistake. Then, slowly, he lowered his head. On one side of the gallery, supporters cried out, insisting it was unfair, that he had been set up, that the system had turned on him. On the other side, victims and their families embraced, tears streaming, believing that at last justice had been served. The contrast was raw, almost violent, relief and outrage colliding in the same space. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was no less divided.
Some fans stood in disbelief, chanting his name, holding on to the image of the icon they had admired for so long. Others cheered, saying no amount of fame or money should place someone above the law. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded the courthouse steps, and the story spread instantly across the globe. It wasn't just about one man anymore. This sentence had become a cultural earthquake. For years, Diddy had represented success, ambition, the American dream wrapped in music and luxury. But now, he symbolized something else, how power, unchecked, could unravel. The silence after the verdict carried as much weight as the words themselves. Everyone in that room knew they had just witnessed history, a turning point not only in his life, but in the way an entire industry would be remembered.
In the days after the sentencing, the courtroom silence gave way to a wave of reactions that rippled far beyond those four walls. For the victims and their families, the decision carried a weight that words could barely capture. Some spoke of closure, a sense that at last their pain had been acknowledged. Others admitted the truth no verdict could erase, the loss, the trauma, the years they could never get back. Justice had arrived, but healing remained an endless road. For the music industry, the shock was seismic. Bad Boy Records had once been a beacon of power, launching careers, shaping culture, dominating charts. Now, executives scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. Contracts were re-examined, and artists, some who owed their fame to Diddy, were forced to reckon with what his name meant going forward. His legacy, once synonymous with ambition and success, had been rewritten in real time. The empire didn't collapse in a day, but its foundation cracked in a way that could never be ignored. And then there was the public. For years, many believed that men of wealth and influence could always outrun the law, that money and fame were shields stronger than any jury or judge. But this sentence challenged that belief. For some, it restored a fragile trust in the justice system. For others, it raised more questions than answers. If he could fall, who else was protected in the shadows? Unanswered questions hovered in the air. Whispers of sealed documents, hidden deals, bigger names that never saw the inside of a courtroom. Were there others who should have been standing trial? Did the full truth ever really make it to the surface, or was this only a fraction of the story? Those doubts lingered, fueling endless speculation and conspiracy. What was undeniable, though, was the cultural shift. Diddy's fall-down marked more than the end of a man's reign. It signaled a turning point in history, when celebrity no longer guaranteed protection, when power no longer promised immunity, when an industry built on image was forced to face reality. In the end, the sentence was more than punishment. It was a message, a warning, a reminder that even the brightest lights can cast the darkest shadows. And as the world moved forward, one thing became clear. The legacy of Sean Diddy Combs would never again be written the same way. As the dust settles and the headlines fade, one question still hangs in the air. Do you believe justice was truly served? For some, the sentence was long overdue, a sign that no one, no matter how powerful, stands above the law. For others, it felt incomplete, as though parts of the truth remain locked away, untold, unfinished. And how will history remember this moment? Will it be seen as the fall of a legend, or as the turning point when an entire culture began to confront its shadows? Years from now, when the music still plays and the hits still echo through time, will people remember the man, the empire, or the judgment that brought it all crashing down? Accountability is a word that's easy to say, but hard to measure. When fame, money, and influence collide with justice, does accountability ever look the same? Was this sentence enough to balance the scales, or was it only a fraction of what should have been done? These questions don't have simple answers, but they're worth asking.
And maybe the most important perspective is yours. The cameras dimmed, the courtroom emptied, but the echoes of this case will linger for years. For some, it marked the end of an era. For others, it was only the beginning of deeper questions about fame, power, and what justice really means when the world is watching. But Diddy's story isn't the only one to shake the industry. Behind the bright lights and flashing cameras, there are other secrets waiting to be uncovered, other names, other legacies, other truths that refuse to stay buried. Next time, we'll uncover another case that sent shockwaves through music, culture, and the courts. A story that proves once again how the line between success and scandal can disappear in an instant.